Desmond Hale placed his trembling hand on the theater door, feeling 60 years melt away in an instant. The demolition notice on the Westmore Theater wasn't just announcing the end of a building, it was his last chance to reclaim what had been stolen from him. That monologue from The Autumn King still lived in his bones, in perfect hibernation since 1961, when studio politics had robbed him of the role destined to make him a star. At 83, his voice might waver, but his resolve did not. What Desmond didn't know was that someone else remembered that audition too, the very man who had once denied him everything. Right before we begin, let us know where you're tuning in from. Some stories change the way you see the world. Subscribe now, because this is one of them. Desmond Hale squinted at the newspaper, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The Sunday morning light streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the small print that had caught his attention. "Margaret," he called to his wife, his voice carrying the slight rasp of his 83 years. "They're tearing down the Westmore Theater next month." Margaret looked up from her crossword puzzle, pencil paused midair. "The one downtown? Where you did all those plays in the 60s? Desmond nodded, his eyes never leaving the article. His long fingers, still elegant despite their age spots and slight tremor, traced the outline of the old theater in the accompanying photograph. "Not just plays," he murmured. "That's where I auditioned for The Autumn King." Margaret's expression softened. In 57 years of marriage, she'd heard the story many times, but never mentioned how the light in his eyes dimmed slightly whenever he told it. "That was a lifetime ago, Des," she said gently. "Indeed it was." He folded the newspaper carefully, but instead of setting it aside, he held it in his lap, staring at it as if it contained more than just words and pictures. "Strange to think it will be gone. All those memories, buried under whatever high-rise they're putting up next." Margaret watched her husband, recognizing the distant look that had settled over his features. She'd seen it before, the expression he wore when revisiting the paths not taken, the doors that had closed too quickly. "I think I'll have another cup of coffee," he said, rising from the table with deliberate movements. As he stood at the counter, his back to her, Margaret noticed how straight he still held himself, the posture of a man who had spent decades being watched, who knew how to occupy space in a way that commanded attention. Even now, in their modest kitchen, wearing faded pajamas and a worn robe, there was something of the performer about him. Something that had never quite been given its due. The Westmore Theater had been cordoned off for weeks, chain-link fencing surrounding the once grand building like a cage around a fading giant. Its Art Deco facade, even in decline, hinted at former glory, the sweeping curves and ornate details speaking of an era when going to the theater was an event, when culture had been dispensed in velvet-seated rows beneath crystal chandeliers. Desmond stood across the street, leaning slightly on the cane he'd recently begun using, more for balance than support. His granddaughter Eliza stood beside him, her dark hair whipping around her face in the spring breeze. "So this is it?" she asked, pushing her hair behind her ears. "The famous Westmore." "This is it," Desmond confirmed. "Or what's left of it." Eliza studied the building, then turned her filmmaker's eye to her grandfather. At 27, she was building her own creative career, shooting documentaries and the occasional wedding to pay the bills. She'd grown up on Desmond's stories, had watched the videotapes of his television appearances from the 70s and 80s, character roles mostly, the doctor who delivered bad news, the kindly professor, the stern father. Solid work that had kept food on the table but never quite made him a household name. "Tell me about the audition again," she said. Desmond smiled, a bittersweet curve of his lips. "You've heard it 100 times. I want to hear it again. Here, with the theater right in front of us." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, Eliza saw something shift, as if the decades had fallen away and he was accessing a younger version of himself, preserved perfectly in amber. It was 1961. I was 25 and had been doing regional theater for a few years. Nothing major, but I was building a reputation. The Autumn King was a new play, but everyone knew it was special. The kind of material that comes along once in a career. As he spoke, his voice took on a richer quality, his diction becoming more precise, the way it always did when he slipped into storytelling mode. The lead character was Richard Crane, a man who had sacrificed everything for success, only to realize too late what he'd lost. It was complex, demanding, the kind of role actors dream about. The audition was held right there. He pointed with his cane to the theater entrance, now covered in graffiti and warning signs. I prepared for weeks. I knew that script inside and out. Eliza watched his face animate with the memory. When I walked out on that stage, something happened. Something I've spent a lifetime trying to recapture. It was as if the character and I became one person. I performed the monologue from the third act, Richard's realization that his empire was meaningless without the love he discarded. When I finished, there was this perfect silence. He paused, swallowing hard. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I'd nailed it. But then what happened? Eliza prompted, though she knew the answer. Desmond's expression hardened slightly. Franklin Pierce happened. The studio executive? The very same. He was backing the production, and he had a protégé, a mediocre actor named Clinton Webb who looked the part but couldn't find the depth with a map and a flashlight. The bitterness in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. 3 days after my audition, I got the call. They were going in another direction. Webb got the part, the play went to Broadway, then Hollywood. And the rest, as they say, is history. Eliza frowned. That's so unfair. That's show business, Desmond corrected, the theatrical quality leaving his voice, replaced by the pragmatism of a man who had long ago made peace with disappointment. Webb became a star. I went on to play supporting roles and character parts. I made a living. I had a family. He smiled at Eliza. I had a good life. But it should have been your part, Eliza insisted. Desmond shrugged, turning away from the theater. Perhaps. But that's ancient history now. They began walking back toward where Eliza had parked, moving at Desmond's measured pace. After a few steps, he paused, turning to look at the theater once more. You know, he said quietly, I still remember every word of that monologue. Eliza studied her grandfather, the straightness of his spine despite his years, the quiet dignity that had always been his hallmark. An idea began to form in her mind. Maybe you should perform it one last time, she suggested. Before they tear the place down. Desmond chuckled, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of consideration that hadn't been there before. Don't be ridiculous, he said. The building's condemned. Besides, who would watch an old man recite lines from a forgotten play? I would, Eliza said simply. Desmond patted her hand affectionately. Sweet girl. Always dreaming impossible dreams. But as they walked away, Eliza noticed how he kept glancing back at the theater, as if unable to completely turn his back on what might have been. That night, long after Margaret had gone to bed, Desmond sat in his study surrounded by the memorabilia of his modest career. Playbills from regional productions, framed reviews that praised his subtle power and commanding presence, photographs with fellow actors on various sets. A lifetime of work that had earned him respect if not fame. From the bottom drawer of his desk, he withdrew a worn script, its cover faded, its pages yellowed with age. The Autumn King, by Thomas Grayson. He'd kept it all these years, though he'd never seen the actual production. Couldn't bring himself to watch Webb stumble through the role that should have been his. He flipped to Act 3, Scene 4, the pages falling open naturally, as if they remembered his touch. The monologue was highlighted in yellow, the ink faded but still visible. His eyes moved over the words, and his lips began to form them silently. The palace stands empty now. The halls that once echoed with laughter now amplify only the sound of my footsteps. I have built an empire of stone and gold, but what is an empire without a heart to cherish it? What is power without purpose? Desmond closed his eyes, letting the words flow through him. They were still there, still perfect, waiting patiently in some corner of his mind where he'd stored them 60 years ago. When he opened his eyes, he found himself standing, the script held loosely in his hand. Without conscious thought, he had risen, his body remembering the blocking he'd planned for the audition. Even now, his right hand made the sweeping gesture that accompanied Empire of Stone and Gold, his voice dropping to a whisper for, without a heart to cherish it. The old magic was still there. Diminished perhaps, like a fire burned down to embers, but not extinguished. Slowly, he sank back into his chair, his heart beating a little faster than usual. Eliza's words echoed in his mind, maybe you should perform it one last time. An impossible idea. Ridiculous, even. And yet. Over the next week, Margaret noticed subtle changes in her husband. He spent more time in his study. His afternoon naps became shorter. Twice she caught him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing facial expressions he hadn't used in years. "Are you feeling all right, Des?" she asked one evening as they prepared for bed. "Never better," he replied, with a lightness she hadn't heard in his voice for some time. "You seem preoccupied." Desmond paused in the act of folding his sweater. "Do you remember the Westmore Theater? The one they're demolishing?" Margaret nodded, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You showed me the article last week. What would you say if I told you I was considering paying it a visit before they tear it down?" She studied him, noting the careful casualness with which he asked the question. "I'd say that's understandable. You have history there. And if I told you I was considering performing there one last time? The monologue from The Autumn King. The one I never got to perform properly." Margaret's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Desmond, the building is condemned. You can't just walk in there." I know," he said quickly. "It's just a thought experiment." But Margaret had been married to the man for nearly 6 decades. She recognized the look in his eyes, the one he got when he was blocking out a scene in his mind, visualizing each movement, each inflection. "Des," she said gently, "some doors are meant to stay closed. Not because we couldn't open them, but because what's behind them doesn't matter anymore." Desmond nodded, continuing his nightly routine as if the conversation had been nothing more than idle chatter. But that night, as Margaret slept beside him, he stared at the ceiling, his mind filled with the image of the Westmore stage, and the sound of that perfect silence after he'd finished his audition, the moment before everything changed. Some doors, he thought, needed to be opened precisely because they had been closed for too long. Eliza arrived at her grandparents' house the following Saturday to find Desmond in the backyard, walking measured paces across the lawn. 24 steps from stage left to center, he was murmuring to himself. Pause on emptiness, then 3 steps forward for, I built an empire. "Grandpa?" Eliza called, setting down the camera equipment she'd brought with her. Desmond turned, momentarily startled, then smiled. "Eliza. I didn't hear you come in. What are you doing?" "Just some morning exercise," he said, but the script in his hand betrayed him. Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Are you blocking The Autumn King in your backyard?" Desmond hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. "I might be." A slow smile spread across Eliza's face. "You're going to do it, aren't you? You're going to perform at the Westmore." I'm considering it, he admitted. But it's complicated. The building is off limits. There's security. And your grandmother thinks I've lost my mind. Security is just one board guard making rounds, Eliza said, her eyes bright with excitement. I've been watching the place all week. He checks the perimeter once an hour, like clockwork. Desmond blinked in surprise. You've been casing the theater. I might be, she echoed his words back to him with a grin. Eliza, I can't ask you to help me break the law. You're not asking. I'm offering. She gestured to the camera equipment she'd brought. I'm a filmmaker, Grandpa. This is the most interesting story I've come across in years. Desmond's expression grew serious. This isn't a film, Eliza. This is. He trailed off, searching for the words. Closure, she suggested softly. He nodded slowly. Perhaps. Or madness. I haven't decided which. Eliza stepped closer, taking his weathered hands in hers. Let me help you do this. One last performance on the stage that should have launched your career. Just you and the empty theater, and me to document it. And if we get caught? Then we get a different ending to the story, she said simply. But at least there will be an ending. Desmond looked down at the script in his hand, then back at his granddaughter, seeing in her the same determination that had once driven him to pursue an actor's life against all odds. All right, he said finally. But we'll need a plan. The plan, as it turned out, was surprisingly simple. Eliza had learned that the security guard made his rounds at predictable intervals, leaving a 15-minute window during which the side entrance near the old loading dock was unwatched. The door's lock was old and relatively easy to manipulate. With a small flashlight and some care, they could slip inside, make their way to the stage, and be gone before anyone was the wiser. Margaret, when finally informed of the scheme, surprised them both by offering not resistance but strategic support. If you're determined to do this foolish thing, she told Desmond, then at least do it properly. She handed him his best suit, not the funeral one, but the charcoal gray he'd worn to their 50th anniversary celebration. Richard Crane wouldn't face his moment of truth in anything less. The night before their planned expedition, Desmond sat alone in his study, running through the monologue one final time. His voice was steadier than it had been in years, fueled by purpose that transcended the physical limitations of age. The words flowed from some deep reservoir of memory, as fresh as if he'd studied them yesterday rather than decades ago. When he finished, he noticed Margaret standing in the doorway, watching him with eyes that shimmered slightly in the lamplight. That was beautiful, Des, she said softly. Thank you, he replied, suddenly self-conscious. She crossed the room to stand before him, adjusting his collar in a habitual gesture of affection. You know, I always wondered what would have happened if you'd gotten that role. I would have been a star, he said, the old dream briefly visible in his expression. Yes, she agreed. And we might never have met. Desmond looked at her, truly looked at her, this woman who had shared his life, who had celebrated the small triumphs and cushioned the disappointments. Who had never once suggested he get a real job even during the lean years. I never thought of it that way, he admitted. Every closed door opens another, she said, quoting something he'd often told their children during life's inevitable setbacks. I'm glad it opened toward me. He drew her into an embrace, holding her with the gentle reverence that had characterized their long marriage. As am I, my dear. As am I. The morning of the performance dawned clear and cool. Desmond awoke before the alarm, his body humming with an energy he hadn't felt in years. They had chosen a Sunday, when the surrounding businesses would be closed and the chances of being observed were minimal. Eliza arrived at 7, dressed entirely in black, for stealth, she explained with a wink. She helped Desmond into the back seat of her car, carefully hanging his garment bag to prevent wrinkles. "Are you ready for this?" she asked as they drove toward downtown. "As ready as I'll ever be," Desmond replied, watching the familiar streets pass by the window. "Though I must admit, I never expected to be breaking and entering at my age." "Consider it a new line on your resume," Eliza teased. "Actor, grandfather, occasional cat burglar." The humor helped ease the tension that had been building in Desmond's chest, not fear, exactly, but the weight of expectation. After 60 years of what-ifs, he was finally going to confront the ghost of his greatest disappointment. They parked 2 blocks away and approached the theater on foot, Desmond moving with measured steps, focusing on each movement to prevent his nerves from manifesting as shakiness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street, still mostly empty at this early hour. The Westmore loomed before them, its facade more imposing up close. Faded grandeur, Desmond thought. Like an aging actor who still retained echoes of former beauty. "The guard just finished his round 5 minutes ago," Eliza whispered, checking her watch. "We have about 10 minutes to get inside." They moved along the perimeter to the loading dock, where decades earlier, sets and costumes had been brought in for productions. The door was secured with a padlock that looked as old as the building itself. "Allow me," Eliza said, producing a small set of tools from her pocket. "Where did you learn to pick locks?" Desmond asked, bemused. "YouTube," she replied, concentrating on the task. "I researched it for a film I wanted to make last year." After a minute of careful manipulation, the lock clicked open. Eliza eased the door open just enough for them to slip inside, then closed it behind them, plunging them into darkness broken only by the beam of her small flashlight. "This way," she whispered, taking Desmond's arm. They moved through the backstage area, navigating around fallen ceiling tiles and debris. The air was thick with dust and the peculiar stillness of abandoned places. Desmond's heart pounded in his chest, but whether from exertion, anxiety, or anticipation, he couldn't tell. When they reached the wings of the stage, Eliza paused, turning to her grandfather. "Give me 2 minutes to get set up in the house," she said, indicating her camera. "Then make your entrance from stage right. Just like you practiced." Desmond nodded, unable to speak. As Eliza disappeared through a side door that would take her to the audience seating, he stood alone in the darkness, listening to the settling sounds of the old building. "This is madness," a part of his mind whispered. "You're too old for this fantasy." But another voice, stronger and clearer, spoke over it, "This is your stage. It always was." He changed quickly into his suit, his fingers only slightly less nimble than they once had been. When he was ready, he took a deep breath and closed his eyes, summoning not just the lines but the essence of Richard Crane, a man confronting the emptiness of his achievements, the hollowness of ambition without love. A soft whistle from the darkness told him Eliza was in position. It was time. Desmond stepped onto the stage. The house lights were off, but enough daylight filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows to illuminate the space in a soft, diffuse glow. The theater spread before him, rows of broken seats, the once plush red upholstery now faded and torn. The ornate ceiling, with its intricate plasterwork, was water-stained and crumbling. But it was still a theater. His theater, in this moment. He took his mark at stage right, exactly as he had blocked it in his backyard. When he spoke, his voice rang out with surprising strength, filling the empty space with words he had carried for a lifetime. "The palace stands empty now. The halls that once echoed with laughter now amplify only the sound of my footsteps." As he moved through the monologue, something remarkable happened. The years fell away. The aches in his joints receded. His voice found depths and nuances he thought had been lost to time. He wasn't acting, he was becoming, transforming into Richard Crane while simultaneously infusing the character with every joy and sorrow he had experienced in his long life. I have built an empire of stone and gold, but what is an empire without a heart to cherish it? What is power without purpose? He crossed the stage with measured steps, each movement deliberate, each gesture precise. This was no longer just Richard's story, it was his own. The character's realization that success had cost him everything that mattered blended with Desmond's acceptance of his own path, the understanding that what seemed like failure had led to a different kind of richness. I stand at the summit of all I have built, master of all I survey, and yet I am alone. Truly alone. His voice broke slightly on the last word, not from weakness but from the pure emotion that surged through him. In that moment, he understood Richard Crane better than he ever had during those weeks of preparation in 1961. Because now he knew what it meant to look back on a life, to weigh accomplishments against losses, to find meaning in unexpected places. The crown weighs heavy not because of its gold, but because of what I sacrificed to wear it. The throne sits empty beside me, a monument to absence. And I would trade it all, every accolade, every victory, every kingdom I've conquered, for one more moment with her. One chance to say what pride kept locked within my heart. As he approached the monologue's conclusion, Desmond felt tears on his cheeks, but his voice remained strong, resonant, filling every corner of the decaying theater with truth that transcended the words on the page. But time makes fools of emperors as surely as it does of beggars. The hours cannot be reclaimed, the days do not flow backward. All that remains is this empty palace, these hollow victories, and the knowledge that comes too late, that love, not power, is the only empire worth building. The final line hung in the air, and then there was silence. That perfect silence he remembered from 60 years ago. The silence that told him he had reached through the space between performer and audience and touched something true. And then, from the shadows of the balcony, there came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. Desmond froze, his eyes searching the darkness. It wasn't Eliza, she was in the front row, her camera still recording, her expression a mixture of awe and confusion. "Who's there?" Desmond called, his voice still carrying the resonance of his performance. The applause stopped. There was a long pause, and then a frail, raspy voice responded. "Bravo, Mr. Hale. After 60 years, you still know how to command a stage." A figure emerged from the shadows of the balcony, making its way slowly toward the staircase. An old man, even older than Desmond, moved with the careful steps of someone for whom each movement required calculation. He descended to the main floor, approaching the stage with the aid of a walker. As he drew closer, recognition dawned in Desmond's eyes. "Franklin Pierce," he said, the name feeling strange on his lips after so many years. The old man nodded, his thin face breaking into a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "In the flesh, what's left of it, anyway?" Desmond stared at the former studio executive, taking in the changes wrought by time. The once powerful figure who had shaped careers with a word was now stooped, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. But the eyes were the same, shrewd, assessing, missing nothing. "What are you doing here?" Desmond asked. Pierce gestured around the theater. "Same as you, I expect. Saying goodbye to an old friend before they tear it down." He tilted his head, studying Desmond. "Though I must say, your farewell is considerably more dramatic than mine." Eliza had risen from her seat, camera still in hand but now lowered. She approached the stage cautiously. "Grandpa? Who is this?" "Franklin Pierce," Desmond said, his voice tight. "The man who gave my role to Clinton Webb." Understanding dawned on Eliza's face. "The studio executive?" Pierce nodded to her. "The very same, my dear. Though, former, is the operative word now. He turned back to Desmond. That was quite a performance, Mr. Hale. Every bit as powerful as the one you gave in this very theater all those years ago. Desmond's expression hardened. You remember that? Remember it? Pierce let out a dry laugh. My boy, I've relived that audition more times than I care to admit. A heavy silence fell between them, weighted with 60 years of divergent paths, of might-have-beens and never-weres. Why did you do it? Desmond finally asked, the question he had carried for a lifetime finally given voice. Why give the role to Webb when you had to know, he wasn't right for it? Pierce sighed, leaning heavily on his walker. Politics. Favors owed. The usual sordid business of the industry. He looked up at Desmond, his expression unreadable. Would it make any difference if I told you I regretted it almost immediately? Did you? Desmond asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Webb was adequate in the role. Serviceable. The play was a success, he became a star, and I continued my rise through the studio system. Pierce's voice grew quieter. But every time I saw him perform that monologue, I heard echoes of how it should have sounded. Of how you made those words breathe. Desmond stepped to the edge of the stage, looking down at the man who had altered the course of his life with a single decision. Why are you telling me this now? Because we're both at the end of our stories, Mr. Hale. Time has a way of stripping away the pretense. And because I saw in the paper that they're demolishing this place, and I wanted to see it one more time. Pierce gestured toward Desmond with a frail hand. Finding you here, that was unexpected. A gift, perhaps. A gift? Desmond repeated, disbelief coloring his voice. Yes, Pierce said simply. A chance to acknowledge what I've known for 60 years, that you should have had that role. That talent should have mattered more than connections. Eliza watched the exchange with growing fascination, her camera now raised again, capturing this unexpected confrontation between two old men linked by a single moment decades earlier. Desmond was silent for a long moment, absorbing Pierce's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, free of the bitterness that might once have colored it. What difference would it have made? If I'd gotten the role? Pierce considered the question. Webb parlayed that role into a career spanning 4 decades. Academy Awards. Wealth. Fame. All the trappings of success in our industry. And a string of failed marriages, Desmond added. Substance abuse issues. Estranged children. I read the tabloids. Yes, Pierce acknowledged. The full Hollywood package, as it were. Desmond glanced at Eliza, then back at Pierce. I never won an Oscar. But I had a marriage that lasted nearly 60 years. I have children who call me regularly, grandchildren who actually want to spend time with me. He gestured toward Eliza. I had a career that allowed me to practice my craft without sacrificing my soul. Something shifted in Pierce's expression, a recognition, perhaps, or envy. And yet here you are, breaking into a condemned building to reclaim a moment stolen from you. That suggests some unresolved feelings, Mr. Hale. Desmond nodded slowly. I won't deny I've wondered, all these years, what might have been. But standing here now, having said those words in this place. He paused, searching for the right expression. I find I'm grateful. Grateful? Pierce echoed, clearly surprised. Yes, Desmond said, conviction growing in his voice. Grateful that I had the talent to make those words live, even if only for myself and my granddaughter. He glanced at Eliza with a smile. And one very unexpected audience member. Pierce studied him, as if trying to determine if Desmond was being sincere or merely performing another role. In the monologue, Pierce said slowly, Richard speaks of trading his empire for love. Would you trade places with Webb, knowing everything you know now? Desmond didn't hesitate. No. I wouldn't. Then perhaps, Pierce said quietly, we both ended up exactly where we were meant to be. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the decaying grandeur of the Westmore, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Eliza who finally broke the spell. Mr. Pierce, she said, stepping forward. May I ask why you really came here today? The old man's eyes flickered with surprise at the direct question. He seemed about to dismiss it, then reconsidered. Webb died last month, he said finally. Did you know that? Desmond nodded. I saw the obituaries. Celebrated actor, age 87. Yes. Celebrated, famous, and alone. His children didn't attend the funeral. Pierce looked up at the crumbling ceiling. It made me think about the ripple effects of our decisions. About what constitutes a successful life. He turned his gaze back to Desmond. I came here to sit in this theater one last time and think about paths not taken. About whether the empire was worth what it cost. Desmond recognized the echo of the monologue's theme in Pierce's words. He stepped down from the stage, crossing the short distance to stand face to face with the man who had once held such power over his future. And what did you conclude? He asked gently. Pierce's expression crumpled slightly, age and regret finally breaking through his composed exterior. That I would trade it all for a fraction of what you have, Mr. Hale. The raw honesty of the admission hung in the air between them. Desmond felt the last vestiges of old resentment dissolve, replaced by something unexpected, compassion for this man who had achieved everything by conventional measures, yet stood before him now so obviously diminished. It's not too late, you know, Desmond said. To build something meaningful. Pierce let out a bitter laugh. At 92. I think time has run out for new beginnings. Perhaps, Desmond conceded. But not for endings with grace. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of a door opening, followed by a man's voice calling out. Hello. Is someone in here? This is security. Eliza's eyes widened in alarm. We need to go, she whispered urgently. Pierce held up a hand. Allow me. He raised his voice, calling out with surprising strength. It's just me, George. Franklin Pierce. There was a pause, then the security guard's voice again, closer now. Mr. Pierce. I didn't know you were coming by today. Spur of the moment decision, Pierce called back. I brought some friends to see the old place before demolition. Former actors from the Westmore's heyday. Footsteps approached, and a uniformed security guard in his 50s appeared at the back of the theater. He nodded respectfully to Pierce. That's fine, sir. Just checking when I saw the door open. His eyes moved curiously over Desmond and Eliza. Thank you, George, Pierce said smoothly. We'll be leaving shortly. Just taking a final walk through the memories. The guard nodded again and retreated, apparently satisfied with Pierce's explanation. When he was gone, Eliza let out a breath she'd been holding. That was close. Pierce smiled slightly. Some doors still open for me, even if they're just service entrances these days. Desmond found himself smiling in return. Thank you. Consider it the smallest of amends, Pierce replied. He glanced around the theater once more. We should go. George is a good man, but there are limits to even my influence these days. They gathered their things and made their way back through the theater toward the exit, moving slowly to accommodate both elderly men. As they reached the door, Pierce turned to Eliza. That camera of yours, you captured the performance? She nodded, holding up the small digital camera. Every word. Pierce looked at Desmond. Would you permit me to see it again? The monologue, performed as it should have been. Desmond hesitated only briefly. If you'd like. Outside in the morning sun, they parted ways with an awkward formality that belied the intensity of their encounter. Pierce handed Eliza a card with his contact information, and they promised to send him the footage once it was edited. As Pierce's driver helped him into a sleek black car, he turned back to Desmond one last time. Thank you, he said simply. For showing an old fool what might have been. Desmond nodded, words unnecessary between them now. As the car pulled away, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, not the closure he had expected to find on the Westmore stage, but something richer and more complex. A recognition that his life, with all its disappointments and detours, had been exactly as it should be. 2 weeks later, Desmond sat in his living room surrounded by family. Margaret beside him on the sofa, their children and grandchildren gathered around. Eliza stood by the television, a nervous smile on her face. So, she began, what started as a crazy break-in turned into something much more. She gestured to the TV screen. Grandpa's performance was so incredible that when I shared it with some film festival friends, it went viral. On the screen appeared Desmond on the Westmore stage, his figure illuminated by the soft natural light, his voice clear and powerful as he delivered the monologue that had lived in his heart for 60 years. The quality was professional, Eliza had edited it beautifully, capturing not just the words but the emotion behind them. As they watched, Desmond felt Margaret's hand tighten around his. On screen, his final line echoed through the empty theater, that love, not power, is the only empire worth building. When the clip ended, there was a moment of reverent silence in the living room, broken finally by applause from his family. That's not all, Eliza said, her eyes bright with excitement. The video has over 1 million views online. And she paused dramatically. I got a call yesterday from the Westmore Preservation Society. Apparently, there's been enough public interest generated by the video that they're reconsidering the demolition. They're talking about a restoration project instead. Murmurs of surprise and delight rippled through the room. But here's the best part, Eliza continued. They're planning a special one-night event before any construction begins. A farewell to the old Westmore and an introduction to its future. She turned to her grandfather. They want you to perform, Grandpa. Officially this time. The Autumn King monologue, on the stage where it belongs. Desmond stared at her, momentarily speechless. Me? But I'm exactly who they want, Eliza finished for him. The man who should have played Richard Crane finally getting his moment. Margaret squeezed his hand. Say yes, Des. Desmond looked around at the faces of his family, then back at the frozen image of himself on the screen, standing tall on the Westmore stage, every one of his 83 years visible in his face and yet somehow transcended by the performance. Yes, he said simply. I would be honored. The night of the special performance, the Westmore Theater was filled to capacity. The seats had been temporarily repaired, the worst of the damage concealed behind drapery, the stage cleaned and properly lit. In the front row sat Margaret, radiant in a blue dress she had saved for special occasions. Beside her was Eliza, camera in hand as always. And next to Eliza, somewhat to Desmond's surprise, sat Franklin Pierce, his thin frame propped up by cushions but his eyes alert and focused on the stage. Backstage, Desmond adjusted his tie, breathing deeply to calm the butterflies that still visited him before a performance, even after all these years. A young stagehand appeared at his side. 5 minutes, Mr. Hale. Desmond nodded his thanks. As the stagehand left, he stood alone in the wings, listening to the murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain. This theater, which had once represented his greatest disappointment, now offered an unexpected gift, not a rewriting of the past, but a new ending to an old story. When the house lights dimmed and the stage lights rose, Desmond stepped out to enthusiastic applause. He took his mark, surveying the packed house, so different from the empty theater where he had performed just weeks earlier. But as he began to speak the familiar words, something remarkable happened. The audience faded away. The years faded away. Even the words themselves seemed to fade until all that remained was the pure communication of one human heart to others. The telling of a truth that transcended the specific circumstances of Richard Crane's fictional life or Desmond Hale's real one. Love, not power, is the only empire worth building. As the final words hung in the air, there was that perfect silence again, the one he remembered from his audition, the one he had experienced in the empty theater with Eliza. And then, thunderous applause. A standing ovation that continued as Desmond bowed, his heart full. In that moment, he understood with perfect clarity that he hadn't returned to the Westmore to reclaim what had been taken from him. He had come to realize that nothing essential had ever been taken at all. The talent, the passion, the ability to move an audience, those had always been his, expressed through a lifetime of performances both on stage and off. As he stood before the cheering crowd, Desmond's eyes found Margaret in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she applauded. Beside her, Eliza beamed with pride, her camera capturing this moment of triumph. And next to them, Franklin Pierce nodded slowly, a gesture of recognition and, perhaps, redemption. Desmond took one final bow, his heart overflowing with gratitude, not just for this moment of recognition, but for the long and winding path that had led him here. For the roles he had played and the ones he hadn't. For the life he had built instead of the one he had once imagined. Some roles, he realized, could only be played at the end of a life fully lived. Some performances gained their power not from youth and ambition, but from the wisdom and grace that come only with time. As he straightened from his bow, standing tall despite his years, Desmond Hale knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't trade a moment of his journey for all the fame in the world. The empire he had built, one of love, family, and quiet dignity, was worth more than any crown of gold. Do you love the story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this one got you thinking, wait until you see the next story. Click the video on screen and keep watching.